Hello and welcome. You're watching WION-VOA Co-Production with me, Molly Gambhir. Our focus in this edition, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has led to tensions in Russia. Voices of protests have been emerging despite the government crackdown on dissent. The city of Saint Petersburg, a center of opposition to the war, is again at the forefront of the citizen unrest. Henry Ridgwell narrating this report by VOA's Moscow bureau. Take a look.
For several years, opposition members of St. Petersburg's city assembly have been meeting in this pizzeria because the authorities won't let them into parliament. In recent weeks, this small group of lawmakers has shaken Russian politics by presenting a formal petition for the impeachment of Russian President Vladimir Putin.
We chose to use a new rhetoric. We are Liberal MPs, and up to now we were concerned more with social issues. In this petition for Putin's removal, we focus on the fact that he has caused fundamental damage to the Russian Federation, not to another state, but to the citizens of our country.
Their demand to remove Putin from power is based on their belief that the war in Ukraine, what Putin calls a special military operation, is a personal project of the Russian president.
I am convinced that if Vladimir Putin ceases to be president, this special operation in Ukraine will not continue.
These opposition lawmakers have already been fined, and they accept that they could face further criminal charges.
Many people are worried that something might happen to us, but someone has to do something.
The petition has also energized St. Petersburg's civil society into open defiance. In this small bar in St. Petersburg, young poets gather to read their poems critical of Putin's war in Ukraine. They believe the time has come to speak their minds.
The courage of the intellectuals who stand against the war gives people hope, gives people motivation and strength to continue fighting, since you discover that you are not alone.
Most people to this day remain silent. But perhaps that is changing because we see the news, but it will take time.
There is an ever-present fear that these actions, no matter how small, could lead to arrest.
Fear affects anyone. It's a normal reaction. Only idiots and Alexei Navalny are not afraid. I am not Navalny, and I am not an idiot. So yes, I am afraid.
Putin's invasion of Ukraine has not only upended global security, but has plunged Russia into political and social instability. The consequences are difficult to predict. Millions of young Russians, an entire generation, face a deeply uncertain future. For VOA's Moscow bureau, Henry Ridgwell in London.
And Voice of America correspondent Jessica Stone joining us now live from the White House. Jessica, good to have you with us. I understand that the U.S. Congress is trying to pass a spending bill by the end of the day to keep the government funded. How exactly will that impact the billions that Washington has pledged to support Ukraine in its fight against Moscow?
Well, there are a bunch of those billions wrapped up into the measure that the House is actually now considering at this hour. The Senate having voted on a stopgap measure yesterday, passing it. It then, of course, goes on to the House, and it has $7.5 billion in military aid to Ukraine, $4.5 billion in economic aid to Ukraine, and it's actually a good thing for this aid to be part of a must-pass spending bill like this. We're literally on the cusp of having to have it passed by the end of the day, as you noted, and so the pressure is on to get this military and economic aid passed as part of keeping the government funded through December 15th. So far, the U.S. has provided more than $15 billion in aid directly to Ukraine, and there are concerns here in Washington about government oversight of those funds, making sure that they are spent properly, and that is going to be addressed in a separate process here in Congress. Molly?
Right. On Friday, the Kremlin held a ceremony to officially annex eastern Ukraine into Russia after it claims that the locals in the Russia-occupied region voted to join Moscow. President Putin has also vowed to defend these territories by all means available. How is Washington now preparing to counter what appear to be nuclear threats at this point?
Well, we had U.S. Secretary of State spokesperson Ned Price respond to some questions around that earlier this week. He said that the U.S. will react swiftly and with, quote, extraordinary consequences if Russia launches any nuclear attacks, big or small, to protect what it now has annexed as its own territory. He says that Washington has been making that case both in public and in private. And on Thursday, two U.S. senators added to the pressure, basically proposing legislation that would remove economic aid from any country who refuses to not recognize the annexation of those lands, which, of course, there has been referenda in those territories of Ukraine. Russia claims that the Ukrainians have voted to join Russia, but the U.S. calls those referenda results sham elections. Now, U.S. officials are also concerned that if there is a nuclear attack of any size, that it will basically spread radiation to other parts of Europe that are under the NATO umbrella, and that could draw Washington into a conflict directly against Moscow. Molly?
Jessica, stay on with me. Let's also get our viewers up to speed with how U.S. President Joe Biden hosted the Pacific Island leaders at the White House. This was on Thursday, offering $810 million of assistance to a region where China is aggressively expanding its influence. The leaders signed the Declaration on U.S.-Pacific Partnership. This covers climate change, security, and trade, despite the initial discord among the summit attendees. White House Bureau Chief Patsy Widakuswara getting us this detailed report. Take a look.
The first U.S. Pacific Island Countries Summit concluded Thursday with President Joe Biden welcoming more than a dozen of the region's leaders to the White House. They signed the Declaration on U.S.-Pacific Partnership, which includes over $810 million in initiatives on climate change, sustainable fishing, pandemic recovery, and trade. It's part of the administration's focus on countering China's influence in the region.
Following appropriate consultations, we will recognize the Cook Islands and Niue as sovereign states. And we look forward to successfully concluding negotiations for a compact free association with three of our closest partners in the region, the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and the Republic of Palau.
The compacts of free association give the U.S. exclusive rights to maintain defense assets in these nations in exchange for funds and security guarantees. Negotiations to extend the compact with the Marshall Islands have stalled amid demands that Washington better address the economic and health impacts of U.S. nuclear testing in the area after World War II.
In addition, climate change is a direct and primary security risk for RMI and Oceania, and I believe the whole world.
Solomon Islands signed a security pact with Beijing in April, raising concerns about a more permanent Chinese military presence. Administration officials and observers acknowledged that Washington had not paid enough attention to the region.
The most important outcomes of the summit are going to be internal to the U.S. government. In the lead up to the summit, there's the dozens of U.S. departments and agencies that have interest in the Pacific. We're coaxed by the White House to figure out what their Pacific Island strategy is, to understand that it's linked to what others across the government are doing. I think it will lead to bureaucratic changes that will elevate the role and the importance of the Pacific Islands in the U.S. bureaucracy.
In July, Vice President Kamala Harris announced the establishment of two new U.S. embassies in Tonga and Kiribati. The Solomon Islands Embassy is also set to be reopened. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News, Washington.
And going back across now to Jessica Stone, who's been with us. Jessica, what pledges did Washington make to both cut down its own greenhouse gas emissions to address the issue of climate change? And what type of aid is it offering to these island nations?
Well, President Biden has already signed legislation just in the last few weeks that is going to cut U.S. greenhouse gas emissions in half by the year 2030. At the summit, though, he promised to extend $330 million specifically in investments to support climate resilience and building a sustainable economy. There's specifically also $600 million to enforce and to uphold the new tuna treaty that is under negotiation that will support the fisheries in the area. That has been a very important issue to the region. And according to a White House fact sheet, $22 million in new funding for climate forecasting, for ocean mapping and research. But many of these funds must be approved by the U.S. Congress. As you know, in a democratic system, the executive cannot universally just write a check. So a lot of this is going to have to go in front of Congress, and that is going to present an interesting challenge specifically to the Republicans in Congress, who are very interested in preventing China from expanding its influence in the region, but also not universally committed to the idea of man-made climate change and paying money in order to mitigate it around the world. Molly?
Jessica, Washington held this summit in order to rekindle and strengthen its relationships with the Pacific Islands, of course, in the wake of China's inroads. How does the financial package offered this week compare to China's investments in the region?
I think a lot of experts are trying to assess that at this hour, and one of them, Patricia O'Brien, who's someone we spoke to for our preview piece earlier in the week, and is an Asia Studies professor at Georgetown, writes a lot for publications such as The Diplomat. She did the math and she said, look, $800 and some million split among 14 or 15 different countries and territories. That is not going to amount, she says, to a lot of money for each country, something like $50 million, $60 million. So it does make the contribution, if you just look at the averages, much smaller. Now, that's not how these funds are going to be distributed, but it does give you a sense that if money is the measure, many of these countries will be looking at the investments that China has made in their region, and they may find the U.S. wanting. For example, Huawei has invested just $60 million alone in putting the infrastructure for cell phone technology in the Solomon Islands. That's just one of these 12 to 14 countries and entities. The question is, will the U.S. be able to really coordinate among its allies, Germany, the UK, Canada, what they call the Pacific, the Blue Pacific Partnership, in order to leverage more international funds, both public and private, to meet the needs of the Pacific? They will push back, though, on the notion that this is just about money. Here at the White House, we often hear that they say, you know, we are the partner of choice over China and the region, specifically because we have democratic norms and we uphold freedom of religion, which they say is very important to people in that part of the world. Molly?
Jessica Stone, we're leaving it there for the moment. Thanks very much for getting us all those details and inputs. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of WION-VOA Co-Production.